growing up as a kid, I would go to my dad, I'd be like, oh, I really want this. I don't know what it could be. I'm an adult now, that was a long time ago. But whenever I'd say, oh, I really want this, he would be like, do you actually need it? And I'm like, yes, I need it, but is it actually a need or is it just a want? And we'd have this conversation. This would get played out quite often. Every time I'd come up to him with something that I wanted and felt I needed right away. And so every time I go shopping, I have this voice going inside of my head, but do you really need that, Andrew? And this just goes on and on when I'm shopping. And so for me to actually make a decision and buy something, it takes me a long time. I've got to go to the shop, I got to go online, look for the best deal, go away and think about it for a while. Do I actually need this? Look at it again. And my wife could tell you this could go on for a year or more as I think about what it is I'm going to buy. And so for me to justify actually the purchase of something, I find really difficult because this voice goes in my head, do I really need it? And we can justify, in fact, humans are really good at justifying things. So if you really want something, if you're fixated on something, you can justify that you need that quite easily. You're your own best salesman, put it that way. I've bought a new car last year, and that doesn't happen very often. Over the last couple of years, I've purchased 2 new cars. All the other cars, all the vehicles I've had have been free. They've been given to me in some way, shape or form, which I'm very blessed for. But the experience of buying a car is actually crazy. The first car I bought, you go to you sign the document to say you'll buy it, but then you get passed on to the aftermarket sales guy. So he wants to put all the accessories in your car, like window tint. And it's that guy. Man, my experience with that guy was just ridiculous. Because my brother-in-law's a mechanic. He was like, say no to everything. Don't get any of the aftermarket stuff. I can get it all for you cheap. They're going to rip you off. It's terrible. And they do rip you off with that stuff. But they just put it into the price of the car and you don't notice the cost. But anyway, so I'm with the aftermarket guy. And he's asking me about window tint. And I said no, so I don't want it. And it just goes on and on. No, still don't want it. Eventually, he's like, see this cancer on my hand, this little cut? That's skin cancer. Do you want your kids getting skin cancer? I said no. Well, you need to get the window tint. No, actually, I don't want it. You would be stupid if you didn't. He literally called me stupid for saying no to him with his window tint. Now, that guy was so pushy. It was just incredible. Of course, I'd already signed up to purchase a car, so I couldn't just back out of it. But even more than that, you are your worst salesman. You are your best salesman. You can justify anything to yourself if you're fixated on it enough. When it comes to making better decisions, sometimes we need to step back from our emotions, step back from what we're fixated on, and actually give us some tools, decisions that aren't based on our emotions in the moment or aren't based on our ability to justify something. So over the next couple of weeks in March, we're looking at some questions to ask ourselves. Just like that question my dad gave me when it comes to shopping. Do I really need it? There's some questions that Andy Stanley puts in a book called Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. And you can go and buy that book online if you want to explore more deeply into the questions that we're looking at over the next couple of weeks. But he has 5 questions. So we're going to look at one tonight, we're going to look at one next week, and I think the week after we're looking at 2. I'm going to bundle them together in a package deal. But having said that, tonight's question is, what story do you want to tell? That's the first question we're looking at tonight. Because all of us have a story to tell up to this point. Now, your story might be partly your own. It could be partly the fact that you've been influenced by your parents, which I think is quite natural. Maybe you've been moved around from school to school growing up. Maybe you've moved interstate, whatever it might be. But your parents have had influence on your story. The good news, and I guess the challenge for us as young adults, for you guys as young adults, is as you grow up, you, as an adult, you now have the ability to write your own story more than you did as a kid. And this question of what story do I want to tell really is a question that gets you to stop and think about the long-term impact decision you're going to make. Is this thing I'm about to do I want to own that? Do I want to be able to share that with people and say, this is part of me. This is part of my life now. Do I really, maybe it's skydiving. You really want to go skydiving. Is that a decision that you really want to own? It's probably a good decision. Maybe a decision like a tattoo might be something that is worth putting in this category. Do I really want a tattoo? Is that something that I want to own for the rest of my life? And because you will own it, it's going to be on you. Obviously, not all decisions are as visible as that. But this whole question gives us the opportunity to stop and to think about the long-term impact of our decision. Is it something that I want to own? Is it something that I want to be telling others? I've got you to share with each other perhaps your best decision. But you know what? This question speaks into some of those not so great decisions that we might make spur of the moment. Maybe it's a purchase that you did in the spur of the moment. You think, if only I'd stop to think, is this something that I want to be sharing with someone? Maybe if you were 10 years older than you are, you might have been watching late night TV and got sucked into buying the Ginsu knife, for instance. It can cut through a shoe. Of course, in these day and ages, we're not exposed to that sort of stuff. But that's just an interesting example. I guess making wise decisions leads to fewer regrets in our life. I guess I've seen a bunch of people that I grew up with in school make decisions which haven't been great. I guess social media allows us to see those decisions in more detail than perhaps previous generations. But I know a number of people that have been married and divorced, have broken families, who are my age, who I went to school with. And that's difficult to see, people making decisions which, if only they'd stop to think about it a little bit more and ask some really good questions to get underneath all the emotions that are going on in our lives and actually get down to the bottom of why is it that we're making these decisions. I used to work in retail, and I used to work with a number of guys there that dropped out of uni chasing money. So they got halfway through their uni degree, got a part-time job in retail, and then saw the money they were making, dropped out of uni, worked full-time retail. And the boss that I worked for at the time, he'd done that. He was now 40-something, still working in retail. I think if only he'd gone back and finished his study. Because he used to tell me, he's like, Andrew, don't do what I did. Don't drop out of uni. Don't do that. I'm stuck here now. I can't get any other job. I've got no qualifications. I can't do anything. It was a great illustration of just a decision that was made without stopping to think, is this something that I want out of my story? Questions, when it comes to making decisions, are a great tool for getting beneath the surface of what's going on in our lives. And why are we wanting to make the decision that we're making? So tonight we're going to look at the person in the Bible called Joseph. And Joseph comes into Genesis, and you may be familiar with his story, you may not. We're going to give sort of an overview of his story tonight and look at some key moments in his life. Now, Joseph was the youngest in his family. And with the youngest, I guess, comes a little bit of favoritism. His dad favored him over all his other brothers. And not only that, but his dad, Jacob, gave him the task of going and checking up on his brother's work as well, which doesn't really bode well, does it? So you've got the youngest who's favoured, who's given a job of just checking up on all the other older brothers and making sure they're doing the right thing. And that led him to be not very liked by his brothers. And we catch up with Genesis 37, verse 18 to 22. His brothers hated him for this. And it says this, when Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in a distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him now and throw him into one of those cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dream. Now, Joseph had aggravated his brothers to the point that they were willing to kill him. You can imagine the strong emotions associated with this decision. They're probably not thinking smart. Now, I don't know if the decision was like, maybe this is a summation. Maybe it was like, yeah, maybe we'll play a trick on him. Maybe we'll prank him. Maybe we'll do something. And it ends up with them deciding to kill him, and it sort of things escalated out of control maybe, perhaps. But you can see that there's huge emotions that have led to this rash decision to kill him. Now, fortunately, there's one brother there, Reuben, who perhaps didn't get quite caught up in all the emotions of what's going on. Maybe he was a bit closer to Joseph than the other ones, but he steps in. And he says this in verse 21. But when Reuben heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. Let's not kill him, he said. Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into this empty cistern here in the wilderness. Then he'll die without our laying a hand on him. Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. Reuben has some great perspective. After all, he was their own brother. He was their own blood. They didn't want that on their hands. He could see that. Now, I'll just pause here for a second. I think when we're forced with making decisions where the stakes are high perhaps, often there's a Reuben in your life that can give you some perspective. And that's a great thing to think about when we're making decisions. Sometimes there's a Reuben around that perhaps isn't as emotionally involved as you are in the decision. And we have a Reuben here, in fact. So thanks, Reuben. Thanks for standing up there. But there's always someone around that we can talk to that's not emotionally involved with the decision. And I encourage you to find someone. If you're in the middle of making a decision or you're planning to make a decision, go talk to someone who's not involved, who's not invested. Anyway, the plan didn't quite work out the way Reuben wanted, because the brothers came back before Reuben could and took Joseph off and sold him to some slave traders heading to Egypt. Now, can you just imagine that for a second? So Joseph, he's betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a disused well, just a big hole in the ground, and then sold as a slave. Could you imagine him just walking off to Egypt? His hands bound, probably in chains, being dragged off. I can imagine he's feeling a bit of emotion, isn't he? Betrayal, anger, the list goes on, doesn't it? I guess one thing that Joseph did have lots of at this point was time. He had time to think about what his brothers did, think about how he was going to get revenge, think about how this wasn't fair, ask God why? Why me? Why did this happen to me? All these things going on in his head. Now, Joseph could have blamed his brothers for what happened. But the thing about Joseph's life is his next decision was still his own. It was still his own. Even though all this stuff had happened to him, his next decision was still his own. And I think that's a good lesson for us. No matter what has gone on in our lives up to this point, our next decision, even how we react to what someone else has done to us, it's actually our decision, and we can own that. But let's continue with Joseph. So he's sold to slavery in Egypt as a slave of Potiphar. Potiphar's connected with the royal household of Egypt. And it says here that the Lord was with Joseph and that he succeeded in everything. Now, I find this quite interesting. So here's a guy who's sold into slavery. He's probably thinking about all this terrible stuff that his brothers has done to him. But all of a sudden, he gets to Egypt. And what does he do? Well, he has success in everything he does. Potiphar sees this. Now, I don't know about you, but I felt that was quite strange as I read it. Thinking, well, surely he could have blamed his brothers for everything, blamed his brothers for where he was sold to, and then just did the bare minimum to scrape by. It's not my fault I'm in Egypt. I shouldn't be here. Why me? It's not fair. Could have gone on and on, couldn't it? But he chooses a different story to own, to be able to tell other people. He chooses a different story. He makes a choice about how he's going to act when he gets to Egypt. And it's something that he can be proud of owning, that he goes full in to serving this house. And he ends up being in charge of everything, which is pretty incredible for a slave. There's two key moments here. First, he has a choice to make about who and what he's going to let choose his next decision. He could have let his anger choose his next decision for him. He could have let his emotions choose that next decision. But he doesn't. He thinks of the long-term impact of what he's doing and the impact that he can make. The second thing, I guess, is he thinks about what is he going to tell about this later? What story is he going to tell about his time in Egypt? He has no idea what the future is going to look like. But he digs in. He makes things happen. And God is with him. Now, it's not long before this causes some issues for Potiphar, or for Potiphar's wife. So she notices him, how successful he is in running the house. Because ultimately, Potiphar trusts Joseph with everything in his house. And Potiphar's wife sees this, sees how handsome he is, wants to seduce him and sleep with him. Now here, Joseph is faced with another decision, isn't he? And I guess we get a bit of a clue as to what he was thinking by his reaction. I think I've got that on the screen there from Genesis 39. So Potiphar's wife asks him to sleep with her, and she bugs him again and again and again to do this. And Joseph replies this. He says, "My master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." See, Joseph gives us some insight into the story he was telling himself. Despite his betrayal, but despite the fact that he was a slave now in Egypt, Joseph tells Potiphar's wife some of his story. I've gained trust. I've gone all into this put. I've been given everything. I've been put in charge of everything except you. You're the person that owns me. You're Potiphar's wife. Now he asks a pretty obvious question here to Potiphar's wife. Why should I be making this decision? What does he say? How could I do such a wicked thing? How could I do this to you? You own me. I'm your slave. Why would you want to sleep with me? Why would I make this decision you're asking me and throw away everything that I've been working towards? I guess he's not just looking at that one decision, is he? He's looking at all the decisions that led to this point in his time in Egypt. And of course, when she's confronted with this, I imagine she's pretty embarrassed, but she ends up betraying him and he ends up being thrown into jail. Again, it seems like one step forward, two steps back for Joseph. And perhaps you know the story. And I encourage you to read it in a little bit more detail than what we can go through tonight. But Joseph ends up in jail in the royal dungeon for political prisoners, where the king kept the very special ones that he had. And what does he do? Well, he has a choice to make again, doesn't he? He has no idea how long he might be. But we see he's telling himself the same story again. And he throws himself into everything that he can get involved with in the jail and earns the trust of the jailer. And eventually he's put in charge of everything in the jail, just like he was in Potiphar's house. Now, the Pharaoh at the time ends up throwing a couple of his servants in jail. And by a rather strange set of events, these two people that are thrown in jail have dreams, and Joseph is able to interpret the dreams. And one of them gets reinstated back into Potiphar's house, back into the Pharaoh's house. And after a couple of years later, the person that got reinstated into Pharaoh's court ends up telling Pharaoh, hang on, there's this guy in the jail that can interpret dreams. And of course, Pharaoh had had a dream. He wanted someone to interpret it. And so Joseph gets called into Pharaoh's court to interpret this dream also. So here's a guy that was a slave, now in prison, now in Pharaoh's court, asked to interpret a dream. It's a pretty incredible story, isn't it? Now, Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream, which is about some, good harvesting years and then some famine, years of famine that happen all over the land. And Joseph finishes interpreting his had, and Joseph then has the guts to give Pharaoh, probably the most powerful man in the world at that time, he gives him some suggestions. I love that Joseph has the courage to step out and make some suggestions to what Pharaoh should do. And I think we've got the verses on the screen there. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is intelligent or as wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. And I guess Pharaoh is just astounded by Joseph's wisdom. I wonder if Joseph ever thought that this was where he'd get to in his life. I wonder where you'll get to in your life. I wonder what story you'll get to tell in 10, 20, 30, 50 years' time. I wonder where you'll be. Well, while Joseph is put in charge of everything in Egypt, the story comes full circle back to his brothers. See, because there had been 7 years of good harvest, and Joseph had been put in charge of collecting that harvest, and now there's 7 years of famine. It's in Egypt, but across, I guess, the known world. And Joseph's brothers and family are caught up in that famine, and they end up going to Egypt to buy grain that Joseph had stored up there. The cycle comes full circle. What does Joseph do? Well, he encounters his brothers. And I guess he's faced with a choice, isn't he? He's faced with a choice. What is he going to do? Is he going to enact what his brothers did to him? Is he just going to disown them? They're not my family anymore. They did those things to me. I've made a new life. I've got a new story. You're not involved in it anymore. He's got a number of choices, doesn't he? And I think in any situation, there's more than one choice we can make. But what choice is he going to write next? If you know the story, you'll be familiar with this. Joseph says this to his brothers. He says, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. The famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither ploughing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive, to preserve many. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And here's the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace, and the governor of all of Egypt." I think that's pretty incredible, Joseph's response, isn't it? He doesn't blame his brothers. He actually recognized it was God working through his brothers. I mean, that's incredible. That's an incredible story to tell out of that terrible situation, that he was sold into slavery, to then be able to say, no, that's not the story I'm telling. The story I'm telling is God's faithfulness out of that. What a choice that is to make. Hope none of us are challenged with such a choice. Just putting that out there. But I guess Joseph responds based on the story he's been telling as he's been going through all these situations in Egypt, that he threw himself into working for Potiphar. It's the story he told Potiphar's wife. God's faithfulness. And now it was the same story he's telling his brothers back. Now I hope at the very least, listening to this story, that we'll all make a decision not to be like Joseph's brothers and tell a story that involves lying for life. See, when they sold Joseph off to the slave traders, they were telling a story. They were telling to their father for life. They were committing to that, to life. Or hopefully we're not like Potiphar's wife, who was committing to that story of betrayal for life. And I bet she regretted that decision when Joseph was in charge of all of Egypt too. I hope you see out of this story that Joseph chose to tell a different story than what was dealt him, a story of God's faithfulness. Now he would have been quite justified, I think, by saying to the brothers, "No, you don't deserve any grain. I'm not going to sell you any. You guys did this to me so long ago. I'm not going to touch you." He could have just left them alone. Didn't have to. They were Hebrews, and the Egyptians didn't really like Hebrews, so he probably could have just fobbed them off, and they wouldn't have even known. They didn't recognize him when they saw him anyway. You know, he could have just done that, or he could have done what they did to him. He could have enslaved them and put them as slaves in Egypt. And he could really have justified many different things to himself, couldn't he? Just like we can in our decisions. But I wonder if he stopped and realized what God had been doing. One thing I haven't mentioned, and I wanted to come back to it, was when Joseph was a kid, he had a dream. And in that dream, God was showing him that one day his family would bow down to him. Now, as a kid, I guess he probably didn't know the full repercussions of what that dream was like. But when his brothers came to Egypt, what did they do? They bowed down to him. He was the second most powerful man in the land. The circle came full circle. The story came full circle. That dream ended up coming true. The reason I share that is because I think that in all of our lives, God has a story that he wants to tell in your life, just like he had in Joseph's life. He had a story that he was working out. And it's great in hindsight because we can look at Joseph's life from a bird's eye view and say, yep, God was there, God was there, God was there. But I don't know if Joseph recognized that when he was a slave walking down to Egypt or when he was put in prison. I don't know if he would have recognized that. I mean, you think following God, things should work out for you. But it wasn't really working out for Joseph. And I wonder in our lives, we don't have the same luxury of being able to look at our life from a bird's eye view. God is wanting to work a story out in your life. And when we stop and we look at those big decisions that we need to make, and we stop and we consider, is this something that I'm going to want to share? Is this something that I want to own? Is this a story that I want to tell? It can help us make some better decisions. It can help us see where God is wanting to work in our lives. Because every decision you make becomes a permanent part of your story. I'll say that again. Every decision you make becomes a permanent part of your story. What story do you want to tell? I guess that's a great question to ask. As we think about our lives, so we think about who you want to be in the next 5 years, the person you want to be in the next 10 years. Who do you want to be? What story do you want to share? So can I encourage you, as I finish here tonight, that if you want to chat about any decisions that you got to make, as I said earlier, there's always a Reuben around. There's always someone you can go and talk to. If you can't think of any, I would love to chat with you. I'm sure Reuben would want to chat with you, maybe not all at once. That's great. I love it. But I would love to chat with you. I'd love to pray with you. Perhaps your parents you want to chat with. Perhaps they're too emotionally involved in the decision you got to make. You want someone outside. One of the pastors here at church would love to chat with you about decisions that you want to face, to give you that perspective that sometimes we just need to remove ourselves from. Could be a friend as well. I encourage you. Catch up with a friend during the week. Have coffee. Have a chat. Talk about this decision that you want to make. I encourage you to do that. Let me pray as we finish. Father, thank you so much for the story of Joseph. Thank you that even while he was in incredible situations of, turmoil, of being betrayed, that he was able to stop and think about who he was, what he was going to do in this situation, how he was going to respond. Thank you that he chose to tell a different story than what was dealt him. Father, I pray for each and every one of us here. I pray that no matter what story has been dealt us, where we've come from, that we'd be able to stop and think about what story you're wanting to create in our lives and what story that we want to share in 5-10 years' time, and make a decision today, this week, this month, this year that leads us in that direction. Father, I pray for anyone here who they have no one to talk to. I pray you'd bring someone into their life that they can trust, that they can share that with. Father, thank you that you are wanting to work in each of our lives to bring glory to you, to make us more like you, Jesus. Thank you for your Holy Spirit that empowers us to do that. As we head out from here, may you continue to lead and guide us by your Holy Spirit, giving us wisdom in making decisions. We pray this week that you would bring conversations into our lives about you with the people around us. that we can be your shining lights here as you use each and every one of us to be your hands and feet. We ask this in your name, we pray. Amen.